Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, where we help new and beginning teachers navigate through those crazy first years of teaching so you can maintain your sanity and personal life. Here's your host, Kim Lepre.
Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kim Lepre, and this is the podcast for new and beginning teachers who don't want to just survive their first few years, but actually thrive. Today, on episode 39, I'm continuing my conversation from last week about making one small change. So if you listened to episode 38, then you know that I suggested how to go about making one small change and planning out the steps so that you could do just something small but manageable to improve your teaching this coming semester. And today I wanted to follow up with that and talk about areas that actually impact your teaching the most. I mean, there's a lot of things that you could do in terms of changing your teaching to improve it. But these areas are actually the ones that have the most impact overall, and all new teachers in general should focus on. So before we get into that, I received another amazing voicemail, and this one is from Rachel, and she's from Detroit, Michigan. And I was really excited to receive this message from her because, for one, I am so excited to receive voicemail and feedback from you guys. But also, I really think that her situation in terms of teaching, a lot of you can relate to. And I also love her reasons for why she loves teaching. So I wanted to start out today with this amazing message from Rachel.
Hi, Kim. I'm a huge fan of the show. My name is Rachel, and I live in Metro Detroit, Michigan. I'm actually an experienced teacher, but I came to find your show because I went back to the classroom this year after some time away. So it was really helpful because, as you know, things change all the time. I teach third grade, all subjects. One thing that I love about teaching is just the relationships that you can build with the students and then also with their families and the community, and just feeling like you're a part of something greater than just your own classroom, that you are having an impact and it ripples through the community. One thing I'm grateful for when it comes to school and teaching, and of course this varies from school to school, but when I find a staff that really is in sync with one another and a supportive administration, that is huge when it comes to just feeling supported, feeling heard, and knowing, just assuming best intentions and knowing that that this admin will have my back, not just blindly, but because there's trust and mutual respect. So that's something I'm always grateful for, as well as when parents and families of the kids are helpful and supportive as well, and just make me feel like a partner or a team member with their child. Something that I'm looking forward to in the new year, I actually started with my students a little bit late in the year, started late November, early December. So because I'm coming in late, I'm looking forward to building an even stronger community. I started doing morning meetings with them, and it's helping, and I just want to make sure that we are, that we gel as a group, as well as, building the academic achievement. But I think having the consistency of the routines is important, now more than ever. I would say my number one tip for surviving this time of the year is find your joy in whatever you can, and just focus on that. So whether it's like drinking a nice cup of coffee or tea, whether it's Netflix, whether it's, journaling, coloring, spending time with friends, going out to dinner, like whatever it is that like makes you have that spark, just remember that even as you're teaching, like sometimes the days get long and bleak in, January, February. And so just think about like, what do you have to look forward to? And then of course also to find someone at the school who is going to be your buddy.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for leaving that message. That was awesome. And so like I mentioned before, Rachel actually has a situation that a lot of my listeners have reached out and told me about, in that they are coming back to the classroom. So this isn't brand new for them, but they've taken some time away. And there's actually quite a few teachers who have reached out to me and told me this exact same thing. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's awesome that you took time off for yourself for whatever reason, and education and teaching called back to you. So I thought that was really awesome and relatable for a lot of us. Also, Rachel is starting later in the year, and I've also had some teachers reach out about that. In fact, one of the teachers that I have been mentoring, she started second semester last year, and it was really tough for her because the students had already been through a couple of different substitutes. So she was their third, and she just felt like it was really hard to get the kids under control and to respect her and be her kids. And I told her, you know what, this year they might not be your kids, which is fine. You can look forward to the next school year when they will be, and you just have to make the most out of what you have. And it sounds like Rachel is doing exactly that in terms of building relationships, because there's nothing that you can do to strengthen what's happening in your classroom more than building relationships with the kids. And they have to be sincere, not, I'm just trying to get you to like me type of relationship building, but mutual respect. I'm the teacher and you're still the student, but we value each other and we take risks and we actually want to be here together. She also mentioned something that I think not enough of us have, and I think it's really sad, but she mentioned being grateful for being in a school where the staff is in sync with one another and where the administration is supportive. It's really hard for us as teachers to feel like we're valued and to want to take the time out of our day to take risks and to, go above and beyond if we feel like we're not being appreciated by our administration, by our colleagues. I mean, it might seem obvious, but when you have been in that situation and also when you haven't, you just really know. And it makes just the biggest difference in the world to just have a school where people enjoy being there, people like each other, people respect each other, and they respect the kids and the administration. They trust that the teachers are going to do what they need to do to get things done. So I've been in both situations, in both scenarios. And when you do get to that school where you feel valued and you feel respected, you pretty much don't want to ever leave. So that's definitely something that I also think is something to be grateful for. And I hope that, Rachel, you're in that situation right now. And as well, you mentioned the parents being supportive. Sometimes there can be too much support. I don't know if that makes sense. Sometimes you have parents in a school where they're not present in the children's lives. And, for whatever reason, they work multiple jobs or because of life, they're not there to really support the school or support the students. And then on the other spectrum, you have parents who are a little too involved and, they want to fight for every single point or every single assignment or have multiple redos so that their student can get 100%. And I think we all want it in the middle where the parents are supportive and they really value their students' education, but they're not trying to do everything for them. And they're allowing them to, make mistakes naturally as needed. And of course, she mentioned finding the joy, not just in teaching, but also, the little things in life. And I really have to agree with her, especially as we come into the second semester. A lot of us are dragging our feet going back to school because we were enjoying that time off so much. We were enjoying sleeping in or just not having anything to do. And you don't want to let all of that go when you go back to school. You want to, still hang on to some of that and maybe even find creative ways to sneak it into your schedule so that you are taking time to take care of yourself while also getting things done at school. So what Rachel had to do to leave that message was go to teachersneedteachers.com/voices. And I had the list of questions there that she was able to refer to while she left the voicemail. And I also had the phone number that you would call to leave a message. So Rachel, you have a sticker on its way. And for those of you listening, if you'd like to leave a message, I would absolutely love to feature you on a future podcast episode.
This is Lindsay
and Kathy of Kindergarten Kiosk, a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Just like the show you're listening to right now.
The opinions expressed are those of individual hosts. Make sure you check out all the other great podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com. And now the learning begins in 3, 2, 1.
So as I mentioned in the introduction, today I wanted to go over 5 areas of teaching that you could focus on or that you could take a look at in terms of that one small change that you need to make to improve. So I wouldn't recommend in any way to do all of these. I mean, you should be thinking about these all the time, but at the same time, I don't want you to try to fix all of them at once. You got to pick one and you have to make a small change. And it's these small changes over time that really add up. So I don't want to overwhelm you at this point because you're already probably freaking out and you feel like there's not enough time. You don't have time to be with your family and friends and get all the work done. So just pick one. And remember that you can't be good at everything now. You know, we're looking for progress, not perfection. And it doesn't mean that you should give up trying to improve the other areas. But if you just focus on one for now, then you'll be able to master that and not have to worry about it as much the next time you're trying to work on something. Okay. So I really want to drive that point home. Don't try to work on all of these at once in terms of improving. So area of improvement number 1, classroom management. So a lot of new teachers feel like they have classroom management down. And I know that maybe you think that that's crazy, but a lot that I've spoken to and have polled have said, yeah, you know what? I got it down. Classroom management is awesome. And the classroom environment is amazing. And then when you ask the principals on what they think new teachers should work on, it's classroom management and environment. So somewhere in the middle, we're not on the same page. So your principal may think, you know what, you need to tighten up your procedures. You need to tighten up the type of progressive discipline that you do. And you're thinking, man, these kids are awesome. They're working really hard. And we just need to maybe take a step back and see what is it that my administrator or maybe another colleague is saying in terms of what I need to work on with my classroom management. Because here's the thing. The most important aspect of teaching that you must master as a teacher before you can do anything else in the classroom successfully is classroom management. Like, you need to have the class in control. I don't mean silent, but they need to be in control, where you know exactly what's supposed to happen. The students know exactly what's supposed to happen. The expectations are clear. Students are respecting one another. They are not, goofing off as much. I mean, we can't avoid all students goofing off. Let's be honest, because if you lead that kind of classroom where there's absolutely no joy, you also probably don't have good relationships with your students. So, I don't mean just sitting there old school, looking forward, silent with their hands folded neatly on their desk. But I mean a way in which you can teach and run your classroom that creates an ideal environment for learning. So what are some aspects that you could work on? For one, you could look at what are your rules and what are the consequences that you've taught your students. So this implies that you've taught them the rules and the consequences. Because here's the thing. You could have all of these consequences, but the question you want to ask yourself is, are you consistent with the follow through? And this is really tough. I remember when I started out teaching, I didn't want to always enforce the consequences or I guess you can call them punishments, because I didn't want to disappoint the students. I didn't want them to think that I didn't like them. I wanted to maintain this positive relationship and rapport with them. And I thought that if I called home or followed through, then I was the mean teacher. But the problem is that students need boundaries. A lot of times, they're just kind of pushing to see how far they can go. And if you just keep letting them go further and further, then they're going to respect you less and less. So you have to draw that line, and you have to have fair consequences that match the offense, and you have to follow through no matter what. So let's think about students who are constantly disruptive. And I want you to think about what types of consequences have you enforced with them? And it doesn't mean that they automatically get a punishment. It could be, proximity. It could be a nonverbal warning. It could be relocating where they're sitting. It could be a, one-on-one talk, email home, phone call home. But what have you done in terms of letting the student know that their behavior is not acceptable? And if you haven't done much, if you just kind of give them the, okay, Johnny, Johnny, not this time, Johnny, and you just, keep admonishing them, but you're not actually doing anything about it, then it's no wonder they're continuing to be disruptive. Also, if you make it sound like there's a way for them to argue their way out of it, meaning that tone that I was just using, Johnny, let's not do that. Johnny, it sounds like they have some wiggle room to justify what they're doing. You're going to need to be firm, not mean, but firm and also emotionless when you deliver that consequence. So I actually have to do this quite a bit in my co-teach class where between 40 and 50% of the students have ADD or ADHD. And so, it's not them necessarily misbehaving either. It's me needing to redirect them because of the fact that they can't stay focused or they are easily distracted. So I don't yell at them and say, you need to sit down. No, I will, do, as I mentioned, some nonverbal cues or stand next to them and just kind of give them a look like, come on now. And when it does come time to relocate them, I'll just say, you know what, Johnny, I really need you to sit over there for now. And it's not because I'm mad. It's because I think where you're at right now is too distracting and I want you to do really well. And so when I say it like that, where it's like, you know what, I need you to do it for me, then Johnny is a little less upset about having to sit over there, especially because he knows that, yes, he's being distracted and distracting at the same time, and it would be a smarter move if he sat somewhere else. And then when it comes time for group work, he can come back to his group. Or if, the next time I have to give him a consequence, I'll say, okay, you know what, Johnny, I need to talk to you after class, okay? So don't leave. And then he stays after and we talk about his behavior. And during that time, I let him know, the next time I'm going to have to send an email home. And I really don't want to have to do that, but it seems like you're having a hard time being successful in class. So I just want to let you know that if this keeps happening again, I'm going to need some extra help so that you can be more successful. So if you notice, I'm not sitting there getting angry about it. Because honestly, at this point, Johnny isn't attacking me with his behavior. It's just that he can't help but misbehave. Now, if you do have a student who is purposely trying to get a rise out of you, you still need to be emotionless and objective about it, even though you want to snap back, be sarcastic, be mean, be angry at that student. Let's remember how old these students are. Remember that they lack the type of impulse control that we as adults should have. So even if they're, maybe using that tone of voice with you, don't match it. Don't go for a showdown with students. So this is just one aspect of classroom management that you could work on. It could be your follow through with consequences, or maybe your rules and consequences aren't actually working out for you. Maybe the reason why you're not enforcing them is because they just don't make sense in your particular environment. Perhaps you wrote them out ahead of time, and then now that you know your students and you know how everything works in your classroom, you need something more appropriate. And then what you can do is work on coming up with new rules and procedures and training your students with those. Another thing you could also do is have students help you write those rules and the consequences now that they've seen the dynamic of the classroom. And that also creates a lot of buy-in. And so when you have to enforce those rules and you have to, give out consequences, you can bring that up with the student. You know what? We came up with this rule together and you broke this rule. So what's the consequence for that? And then they tell you and you're like, yeah, so sorry, man, that's how it is. So the second aspect of teaching that you can focus on is lesson planning. Now, I know that this is something that a lot of new teachers struggle with, unless you're given a completely scripted curriculum. In that case, you might not have a choice in terms of what you teach and when. But for the rest of us that don't, we just have a list of standards that we need to cover in a certain amount of time, and good luck getting that done. We might have a textbook, we might not. Maybe your PLC plans together and you have a pacing guide, but maybe you have a department or PLC where nobody wants to share anything with you or with each other, and they're all just sort of hoarding the materials and what they're doing when. I've actually had a couple of teachers reach out to me about this, and I don't know, that's really frustrating. I can't imagine why teachers would want to protect what they're doing and not share so that all students can benefit. I mean, if I'm doing something that's working for my students, why would I be so selfish as to just keep it to myself? It doesn't mean that I have to give away all of my worksheets and all of my materials, but I don't think it hurts to tell someone what I'm working on that week and the way that I'm teaching it, especially a new teacher, so that they can improve. But I digress. So lesson planning is something that actually takes a while to master because you're still figuring out what it is that students need to learn and how they're going to get there. I mean, yes, you did study that when you went to get your teaching certificate, but now that you're in it, it's a little bit different. So even with the list of standards, you have to ask yourself, what does that look like? So if the standard is that they are going to write a summary in third grade, what does a good third grade summary look like? And what are the steps that my students need to take in order to write a good summary? What are the skills that they need to learn in order to write a good summary? So you need to have a clear map of where the students need to be by a certain point in time. And if you're like, well, I don't know where they need to be, then maybe you look at some sort of assessment or a benchmark, maybe at the semester, and then you work backwards from there. And I do this with my PLC, and we'll take a look at the end of course exam, and we'll look at the standards that are being assessed on that end of course exam, and we'll see what we definitely covered really well and what we need to still work on. We also look at the data from the previous year, how the students did in terms of their performance on the end of course exam. And that data also guides what we need to do in terms of improving our own teaching. For example, if students did really well on identifying theme, then I'm going to keep doing what I did before. But if they're struggling with figuring out the main idea or central claim, then I'm going to bump up my lessons and maybe, switch things out because I didn't do so well last year. So for this next semester coming up, what you can do is take a look at any type of assessment that you've given so far, as well as the standards that you have taught so far, and see what still needs to be worked on. And if you need a frame of reference, you can use the standards that are going to be assessed on an upcoming state exam, or, again, if your department or your PLC has benchmarks that you need to meet, where are your students in relation to that? And that can guide your teaching and your planning for the upcoming semester. And as I mentioned before, effective lesson planning, it doesn't necessarily come naturally. It is so much trial and error. And especially if you're an elementary school teacher and you're moving grades a lot, it can be especially difficult because each year or each different grade level, you have to have a picture of what those students should be able to do. And so taking time to work backwards and, use some sort of frame of reference and figure out all the skills involved so that they can meet that particular standard or skill will really help you in terms of improving your lesson planning. And also you can reuse those lessons next time and just tweak them as needed. So the third area that you could improve upon is lesson delivery. So most students don't like English. They don't like reading. They don't like writing. Of course, there are a lot that do, but most don't. They just think that it's sort of this, soul-sucking subject that they're just required to do. And yet, my class is my students' favorite class. At least 90% of the students say that my class is their favorite, even though it's a subject that they really don't like. And why is that? It's because of the way that I deliver my content. So, the way that I am on this podcast, I'm like this, but more animated. I'm like this, but I use analogies and references to things that are in pop culture and things that they can relate to. And I've mentioned this before in previous episodes, that it's really important to make your content relevant to the students. I mean, if you use a reference that they're familiar with and they get excited about, they're definitely going to listen to what you have to say next. But if you just keep droning on and on without any thought to whether or not it's something that they might be interested in, then your students are going to tune out. And it's just normal. I mean, think about it. You've sat in a staff meeting before where you were bored out of your mind and you spaced out because you just didn't feel like what was being said to you was important or relevant at that time. And also because you're probably tired and just ready to go home. So if you're someone who has been just standing in the front of class and lecturing, if you are a little bit on the quieter or meeker side, then maybe that's something that you want to try to change up this semester. So if you spend a lot of time lecturing, then you want to consider adding more student interaction. So maybe for every 10 minutes that you are giving direct instruction, add a think, pair, share, or some kind of group activity for at least 3 minutes. The benefit of doing this is that you're giving students time to process what you just said. And also it gives them a break from just sitting there listening and they can interact with their peers. It's really, really important that you give them regular breaks to process and interact. So that's something that you could change up if you have more of a lecture style of teaching. If you tend to be quieter or, really calm and maybe a little bit meeker or not as strong and confident in your teaching, then maybe you can work on that because it's really hard to keep students engaged if, number one, they're straining to hear you because at some point they're just going to say, I can't hear her, and then they're going to tune out or space out. Also, if you don't seem confident in what you're teaching, they're going to question in their minds whether or not they should be even listening to you. So how can you work on this? One thing you could do is you could practice in front of friends or family. You could give a lesson and have them to pretend to be a student. You could also videotape yourself and you could try to just be more animated. I'm not saying that you need to be, jumping up and down and gesticulating wildly and being completely crazy in your classroom, because I'm not that way, but just being more energetic and engaging and getting the students excited about your material. I mean, I never found physics to be fun. I think it's really hard and it makes my brain hurt, but my physics teacher in high school was amazing. And he made it so that I was constantly cracking up and laughing. And even though my brain was hurting, I wanted to be able to do all of those problems successfully. I wanted to be good at physics because I connected with him and his energy was just infectious. So how can you amp up your teaching so that students will be happy to be there, that they'll look forward to coming to your class? Maybe not to your subject, but to your class every day because they just feel like you're just so much fun and engaging. So the fourth aspect that you can work on is assessment. Now, these may already be given to you. Like you have to give these assessments. We all do these common formative assessments. But either way, whether you're writing them yourself or you are giving district or school mandated ones, using assessment to guide your teaching is really important. It took me a while to actually appreciate the value of assessments. I used to hate them, especially when I switched over to English. I was like, why do I have to give all of these tests? What's the point of this? It's such a waste of my time. I hate giving tests. I hate taking tests. I hate the thought of my students suffering with tests. Until finally I realized that assessments aren't just tests. I don't have to only use multiple choice to assess my students. In fact, it's better for me to use writing to assess my students. I think one of the biggest problems that I had when I was starting out with teaching English was doing something with that assessment data. So maybe you have that issue where, you are giving assessments, but you're looking at all of their results and getting frustrated with what you see. I remember wondering what I was doing wrong. How come the students weren't getting it? I remember maybe even blaming the students, like, these students are so low. Why aren't they getting it? Until I realized, you know what? It's me. It's me and my teaching. And so then I was able to adjust my teaching, tweak lessons, spiral in more lessons so that they could meet those standards. So one aspect maybe of assessment that you might want to work on is taking a deeper look at the data and looking at trends and using that data to inform your teaching. I think that's one of the best uses of data is to guide our teaching. Some people kind of like poo-poo this idea of data being important because they're like, no, kids are more than a number. Kids aren't just data. And of course, this is true. But how do we know how effective we are if we're not taking measurements along the way? How do we know if kids are hitting the mark? So much of grading is so subjective as it is. So if we're not giving regular assessments and having, rubrics and benchmarks and, exemplars of what your students should be able to do at certain points in the year, how do you know if they're actually getting better? And I like to think of it like with losing weight, for example. How do you know that you've lost any weight? Well, there's multiple ways to measure your progress. You could weigh yourself. You could take your body fat composition. You could take measurements. You could take pictures. So we can use these different forms of data and use it to determine whether or not we're making progress on weight loss, which a lot of people are trying to do right now this time of year. And actually, that reminds me. So back in July, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I promise it relates. Back in July, I went and saw my doctor, and I get my blood work done every single year. And he told me, wow, your cholesterol is high. It shot up, and, your triglycerides and all of that. And I was like, oh, wow, that's too bad. All right, I'll see you next year. And he's like, not so fast. I need you to come back in January, and we're going to redo these tests, and I want to see better numbers. And of course, I was really upset because I was like, wait a minute. January, that means right after the holidays. That means I can't be gluttonous and have fun during the holidays if I'm supposed to come back with better numbers. And he's like, yeah, that's the point. I want you to get serious about getting your cholesterol under control. So, I had to do a lot of stuff. I had to exercise more and eat better. And it was, actually, I'm pretty good at that. When I set my mind to something, I go all in and I do a pretty good job. And luckily, my numbers got a little bit better, but not as good as I would have liked considering all of the effort that I put in. But if I hadn't been tracking my progress, if I didn't have the before data and the after data, then I wouldn't know if what I was doing is effective. And honestly, I kind of feel like what I've been doing isn't effective enough. So I'm going to have to research that because I have been working out 3 times a week. I've been eating low carb, lots of vegetables, lean protein, all that kind of stuff. And I expected better numbers. So obviously what I'm doing is not working. And so that's the beauty of data. So even if you don't like data, it really can help you see how you're doing and what you need to improve. Also, one thing that you could work on in terms of assessment is looking at the types of questions that you write and also the answer choices. I don't know about you, but writing an assessment can actually be really difficult. So we did this a couple years ago in my PLC. We did a pre-test and a post-test for a lot of different standards. And the test writing process was really difficult, especially if you're doing multiple choice. But even if you're doing, just fill in or short answer, writing a question that makes sense to the students and is actually assessing them in a way that you can figure out what they do and don't know is hard. The wording is really difficult because if it's confusing, then you're going to end up with a bunch of students answering that question incorrectly. So one thing that you could do is go back and look at previous assessments and see which questions are students consistently answering incorrectly. And really examine it and see if it's the wording of the question that threw students off. Or maybe it's also the wording of the answers that threw students off. Maybe there was more than one answer and you didn't really realize it. Like one of the answer choices, maybe C was not the correct answer, but the way that it was worded, it could have been right. And so a lot of students chose that one. So I do like to do test analysis and error analysis and just to improve my tests all the time, because if you have something like that where the question is confusing or the answer choices are too vague or too similar to one another, then you're not really getting accurate data on how students are doing on that particular standard. So that's another thing that you could tweak this coming semester. One aspect of being a teacher that you could work on is grading. Grading is an ongoing thing because we come in a lot of times grading either the way that our master teacher graded, or a lot of times even the way that we were graded when we were in school. And it just kind of runs the gamut in terms of, late work policies, or, are you going to take off points for not having a proper heading? Just the way that you assign points, or if you use standards-based grading, and maybe in your school, you're mandated to use a certain type of grading. Maybe you have to use standards-based grading. I know of a school here in California where if a student turns in an assignment late, teachers are required to take off a certain number of points if it's late. And I'm thinking, wow, that really takes a lot of power out of the teacher's hands in terms of grading. But in any case, you might want to look at how you've been grading and whether or not the grades that you have reflect your students' abilities. I'm going to save a lot of the grading conversation for a different podcast episode because it's really dear and important to me. But as a new teacher, one thing that you could look at is, again, the scores that you have and whether or not the grade correlates to the student's ability. So if a student is turning in all of their work, but they're not quite hitting the mark, but they have an A because they're turning in all of their work, you might want to rethink that, because that is actually falsely communicating to the parents and to the student that they are doing stellar work and that, they are an A student. Well, if you really think about it, though, an A student should be someone who is consistently getting answers correct. They're consistently performing at grade level. And if a student isn't doing that and they have an A, well, then there's a disconnect. So you could look at the way that you grade, maybe some of your weights. I don't know if you guys use weighted categories, like maybe certain projects and assignments are worth more than maybe just little quizzes or homework. This is another thing to think about is, how much is homework worth if you even give homework? Is something that is done at home with supervision possibly, or I know some parents who have done the homework for students, or some students who don't have a quiet place to do homework, so they're at a disadvantage. How much of a student's grade is affected by homework when, honestly, you have no control what happens once they leave your classroom? So, looking at grading policies is actually really important because they're going to change over time. I can tell you now, they're probably going to morph as you teach more and as you look at your students and as you learn more about educational philosophy and all of that. You're just going to think about them differently. Even if you're already using something like standards-based grading, you're still not going to use the exact same grading system. I know some teachers who were using standards-based grading, and then they went to single column rubrics, and then they went to badges, and then they went back to just a 4-point scale. And it just kind of changes depending on your overall philosophy, or maybe even the way that your site or district is asking you to grade. And honestly, I take a look at my grading policies every year. Even though I feel so passionately about the way that I grade, I still look at them very, very closely to make sure that the grades are reflecting what students truly know. And I didn't always do standards-based grading, and it took me about 5 years to do it consistently. I know that sounds crazy. You might be thinking, Kim, why don't you just make the switch? And it's because it's hard. It's really hard to wrap your brain around it. It's hard to do it consistently. It's hard with those battles, especially with the way that we've been graded growing up. A lot of us were graded with, 10 points taken off if it's a day late. Or we've been graded with some very draconian policies. And it was hard for me to break free from those because that's all that I knew. So it took me a while to make it work for me and to feel really good about it and do it consistently, and also be able to defend it and promote it, because I had colleagues who were like, I want to try that, but I don't know if it's going to work for me. And, I don't like to recommend anything that I haven't tried myself because I feel like a fake. So I had to do it and then be honest with my colleagues about the journey and how difficult it was. But I think that they appreciate my candor because that way when they struggle, they don't feel like they're being stupid. Anyway, my point is, taking a look at your grading policies is something that should be ongoing, and that's something that you can work on this semester. And my final aspect of teaching that you could work on is your relationship with parents and colleagues. So since you're new, either to teaching or to your school, there's a good chance that you're hanging out in your classroom a lot, trying to get a lot of stuff done because you're overwhelmed and, you're not really necessarily socializing or getting to know your colleagues. It's actually really important that you do reach out to them because they are going to be there to support you. It may not seem like it. I know that there's some colleagues who maybe are like, no, I can't be bothered right now. But you want to get to know them because you're going to need to be able to lean on your colleagues when you need help. And you know what? As a new teacher, you always need help. So when I started teaching, I actually had a lot of anxiety about getting to know other teachers. And I'll talk about that in a different podcast episode. And so I would just lock myself in the band room, which is actually really easy because I was the only person who taught band in the school. So I also felt like I didn't connect with anybody else. And it took me, I want to say 5 years before I really started making friends in my school, just because I just stayed in my room and it was just more comfortable to just be me. And if you know the band director at your school, they probably spend a lot of time in their classroom because there's always stuff that they need to do, or there's students coming in during lunch. And it wasn't until I started going to the staff lounge that I made friends. And it was so awesome to have other teachers to talk to, even though they didn't know my content area. It didn't mean that they didn't know about classroom management or how to plan a lesson or who to go to if you need this and this and this done. I mean, they were really, really helpful. And the friends that I made really shaped who I am as an educator today. So I really encourage you to think about maybe being a little more social this semester, even if it's just the people down the hall, or maybe going once a week to the staff lounge if people eat lunch there. I understand that sometimes going to the staff lounge isn't fun because there are teachers who go there to vent and complain, and so it can feel really negative. But there's still something to be said about getting to know the staff in your school, not just the ones that teach your grade level or in your department, but getting to know other teachers and also getting different perspectives. I feel like we're in a time right now when we don't necessarily want to hear the perspectives of people who think differently than us. But it's really important as a teacher, as a new teacher, that you listen and observe other teachers, especially veteran teachers, because that's how you're going to grow. Even the stuff that you disagree with, if anything, it's going to solidify what you do already believe. But there have been so many times when I don't necessarily agree with another teacher, and yet they surprise me because later on I'll be like, you know what, so-and-so mentioned that, and at first I blew it off, and now I realize they were right. That actually does work for my situation. So just be open to getting to know other staff members, and it's really going to help you grow a lot faster and be more confident in your teaching. Also, maybe as a new teacher, you're not as comfortable communicating with parents. So if you haven't been sending regular emails home, now would be a good time to start. You can just send just basic emails to them. It doesn't have to be a beautiful, fancy newsletter, just updating them on what's going on in the classroom, any upcoming tests or major assignments. They really appreciate that because it can also help them with planning, or let's say that they're thinking of going on a vacation, but there's something that's going to be going on that week. They might postpone that vacation so that their student doesn't miss out. So keeping the parents in the loop really makes them happy. And also you can reach out for volunteers. And a lot of parents, if they're stay-at-home parents, they would love to come in for 1 or 2 hours and help you with things like sorting or putting up your bulletin board or organizing in general. One way that I keep up with parent communication is I let them know about upcoming due dates, and I also send home reminders. So on Sunday, if there's an assignment due on Monday, then on Sunday, I'll send home a reminder to the parents and students. And of course, they always appreciate that because students procrastinate and they wait until Sunday to do their homework or any kind of studying for an upcoming test. And if there's something that's going to even be due the following week, I give parents a heads up because it actually has saved my butt a couple of times. If students have 2 weeks to do an assignment, maybe like a project, and I let parents know, then they check in with their student and make sure that they're staying caught up. And also that way, if a student doesn't get it done on time, and, the student is coming up with excuses about, oh, I had a game last night, or I had this last night. And I let the parent know, you know what? They had 2 weeks to do that. They just procrastinated. And so instead of the parent getting mad at me for being unreasonable about accepting late assignments, now we can talk to the student about time management and procrastination. So, make the parents your allies. Work with them. Try to be empathetic to what they need as a parent. Don't give them too much, but at the same time, give them enough information so that they can support their student in the best way possible. And if you are a parent, think about what type of an email would you want to receive from your child's teacher. What would be helpful for you considering your schedule and workload? And also keep that in mind with the tone that you use in these emails. You don't want to sound accusatory. You don't want to sound like the kids are going to get in trouble if they don't do something. Just try to be positive and seek out the parent support. And it's really amazing what that'll do in terms of building that relationship with the parents, especially if in the future you end up having any issues with their student. So just to recap, the areas that I mentioned that you could work on for this coming semester is classroom management, lesson planning, lesson delivery, assessment, grading, and communicating with parents and colleagues. So think about which one of these areas you might want to work on. And of course, there are other areas that you could work on. But again, like I said, these have the biggest and most immediate impact. And honestly, that's really important. If you've ever tried to, do New Year's resolutions, one of the reasons why people fail or fail to follow through is because they're not seeing results fast enough, or they're not seeing meaningful results. That's why a lot of people stop exercising when they don't drop 10 pounds in 2 weeks, because they were hoping it was going to be easy. So focusing on one small aspect of one of these 6 will help you feel more accomplished this year and help you improve your teaching in small but significant ways. Now, in addition to leaving a Google voicemail with why you love teaching, or if you haven't started teaching, you could also leave a message about what you look forward to most about teaching. I would love to hear what you are working on this semester. And if you remember, I am going to be working on creating self-directed lessons that students can go through in order to learn and master grammar. So I've already looked at a couple of different websites. I've looked at some other templates. I've read some articles, some blog posts, and I'm trying to gather all the information so that I can try to think of different ways to do this. I know some people like to use learning menus. I mentioned before hyperdocs. And so I'm really trying to wrap my brain around it. And then this week, because I have one more week off, I'm going to start on the first couple of concepts. I'm going to test one of them out first before I do all of them, because I don't want to make all of them when one of them doesn't even work. Does that make sense? So I'm going to be working on that, refining that. So for me, I guess that would go under lesson planning that I want to work on, because I've been kind of failing my students in terms of grammar, and I want to fix that because it's about time, Kim. It's been 17 years. It's about time I got this down. So I would love to hear what your one aspect of teaching is that you are going to change or slightly alter. So you can email me at kim@teachersneedteachers.com. And if you have forgotten what the 6 different aspects that I talked about are, you can go to teachersneedteachers.com/39, and I'll have all of that information there. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I hope you have a fabulous week.
Thanks for listening to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast. Love this episode? Head over to Apple Podcast or Google Play to subscribe, rate, and leave a review.